Savannah, Georgia, October 1834. The Matthews sugarcane operation was struggling to compete with Louisiana plantations, driving enslaved workers beyond human limits. By dawn, 20 overseers lay dead in the cane fields, victims of the most coordinated act of resistance Georgia had ever witnessed. What began as whispered conversations in the slave quarters became a night of reckoning that would terrify plantation owners across the South. If you're ready to hear one of America's most suppressed stories of resistance, hit that subscribe button now. October 1834 found the Georgia coast trapped between seasons, too hot for autumn, too violent for summer. The Matthews operation sprawled across 800 acres south of Savannah, where 180 enslaved people worked experimental sugarcane fields that struggled to match the profitability of Louisiana's massive plantations. Samuel Matthews had invested everything in proving that Georgia could compete in the sugar market. His smaller operation depended on pushing his enslaved workforce to levels of productivity that seemed impossible, working longer hours under more brutal conditions than even the cotton and rice plantations that dominated the region. The cane harvest of 1834 was make or break for Matthews. Financial pressures from Savannah creditors meant that failure would result in the sale of his entire enslaved population to settle debts. This desperation had transformed the plantation into a pressure cooker where 20 overseers drove people past every reasonable limit of human endurance. The cutting season demanded precision timing. Sugarcane had to be harvested at exactly the right moment and processed within hours, or the entire crop would be lost. This created relentless pressure that began before dawn and continued long after sunset, with overseers using whips and worse to maintain the punishing pace. At the center of the enslaved community was Caesar, a man in his late 30s who had been transferred from a South Carolina rice plantation 3 years earlier. Caesar possessed two qualities that made him invaluable to his fellow workers. He could read, and he understood the mathematics of sugar production better than some of the overseers themselves. Working alongside Caesar was Sarah, a woman who served as the unofficial healer for the enslaved community. Her knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties had kept dozens of people alive through injuries and illnesses that would otherwise have been fatal. But Sarah understood that the same plants that could heal could also kill. The breaking point came during the second week of October, when Overseer Thomas Bradley beat a 15-year-old boy named Joshua to death for collapsing during the afternoon heat. Joshua had been cutting cane for 14 hours straight when he fell unconscious, but Bradley interpreted this as defiance and made a public example of him. That night, as the enslaved community gathered around Joshua's body, Caesar stood before them with a proposal that would change everything. The harvest schedule had created an opportunity that might never come again. The overseers were exhausted, isolated, and following predictable routines that made them vulnerable. What Caesar proposed was not spontaneous revenge, but a carefully planned elimination of the plantation's entire management structure. 20 overseers would die in a single coordinated action, and those responsible would disappear into the Georgia swamps before authorities could respond. The plan required absolute secrecy and perfect timing. Any leak would result in immediate execution for everyone involved. But Joshua's death had created something that Caesar could build on, a shared understanding that some things were worse than death. Sarah's role would be crucial. Her knowledge of poisonous plants native to coastal Georgia could incapacitate overseers before the direct action began. The processing would take weeks of careful preparation, gathering materials during routine work activities without arousing suspicion. The plantation's layout favored the plan. The overseers lived in scattered quarters throughout the property, making coordinated defense impossible. More importantly, the isolation that Matthews had chosen to hide his experimental sugarcane operation from competitors would work against him when his management structure disappeared overnight. Caesar began recruiting carefully, identifying people who had the skills and determination needed for different aspects of the operation. Solomon, a blacksmith who maintained the plantation's tools, could modify implements into weapons. Maria, who cleaned several overseer quarters, could introduce Sarah's preparations into their food and drink. The date they chose was October 28th, a Saturday night when the overseers would be relaxing after the week's most brutal harvest push. The timing would also take advantage of Sunday's lighter work schedule, meaning that the absence of overseers might not be noticed immediately by neighboring plantations. As the date approached, the enslaved community began to transform. People who had been broken by years of brutality discovered reserves of strength and purpose they had forgotten they possessed. The plan gave them something more powerful than hope. It gave them agency. But Caesar understood that success would require more than courage. It would demand the kind of coordination and discipline that their oppressors claimed enslaved people were incapable of achieving. The next 2 weeks would prove whether that claim was another lie used to justify an profitable system of human bondage. The preparation phase began with Sarah's dangerous work of gathering and processing the materials that would eliminate the first wave of overseers. Coastal Georgia provided several plant species that could be lethal when properly prepared, but obtaining them required careful planning to avoid detection. Sarah's regular duties included gathering medicinal plants for treating injuries among the enslaved population. She expanded these expeditions to include trips deeper into the surrounding swamps, where she could harvest the deadly materials she needed without any overseer questioning her activities. The most effective option was water hemlock, a plant that grew in the marshy areas near the Savannah River. When properly processed, it could be tasteless and odorless when mixed with alcohol, making it perfect for introducing into the overseer's evening drinks. The challenge was processing enough quantity to affect multiple targets while maintaining absolute secrecy. Sarah worked with 3 trusted women during the pre-dawn hours when overseers were least likely to be patrolling the slave quarters. They processed the plant material in Maria's cabin, which was positioned to provide early warning if anyone approached. The work was painstakingly slow. Rushing the preparation could result in detectable residue or ineffective concentrations. Meanwhile, Caesar was developing the coordination system that would ensure simultaneous action across the plantation. The key was using existing work patterns and communication networks without creating any unusual activities that might alert the overseers. The plantation's daily operations already required coordination between different work gangs, with leaders communicating about schedules, tool allocation, and productivity targets. Caesar realized he could embed coded messages within these routine communications, passing detailed instructions without creating suspicious new patterns of interaction. The code was elegantly simple, based on agricultural terminology that would mean nothing to overseers but conveyed specific information to those who understood the plan. A comment about clearing the north fields before the rains meant that the northern section would begin their action when they saw the signal from the sugar processing building. Discussion of sharpening tools for Monday's work indicated that weapons should be prepared and positioned. Solomon's work preparing modified tools was equally dangerous. As the plantation's blacksmith, he had legitimate access to all the cutting implements used in cane harvesting, but turning machetes and axes into more effective weapons required subtle modifications that couldn't be detected during routine inspections. The modifications were small but significant. Slightly resharpened edges, strengthened handles, better balance for use as weapons rather than agricultural tools. Solomon worked on these improvements during his regular maintenance duties, spreading the work over several weeks to avoid creating any noticeable changes in his routine. This incredible story of careful planning and resistance deserves to be shared. Please like this video and tell others about this forgotten chapter of American history. By the 3rd week of October, Sarah had successfully prepared enough processed plant material to affect 12 of the 20 overseers. The material had been divided into small containers that could be easily concealed and transported to the different overseer quarters where it would be introduced into food or drink. The women who would carry out the poisoning understood they were risking immediate execution if discovered. Maria would handle the quarters closest to the main house, while 2 other women would cover the outlying buildings. Each had developed cover stories about cleaning duties or supply deliveries that would explain their presence near the overseer quarters. Caesar's coordination network had expanded to include every work gang on the plantation. Each group understood their specific targets and timing, and backup plans had been developed for situations where the primary approach might fail. Most importantly, escape routes had been identified for those who wanted to attempt reaching freedom in the aftermath. The plantation's location worked both for and against escape attempts. The extensive swamplands provided concealment for people who understood how to navigate them, but they also contained dangers that could be fatal for the unprepared. Several of the enslaved workers had grown up in the area and possessed knowledge of safe paths through the wetlands. As October 28 approached, the psychological transformation of the enslaved community became increasingly visible to those who knew how to see it. People walked differently, looked each other in the eyes differently, spoke with subtle changes in tone that reflected their growing sense of power and purpose. But the preparation had also revealed the enormous risks involved. If even one person broke under pressure and revealed the plan, everyone involved would face immediate execution. The plantation's isolation that helped conceal their preparations would also prevent any possibility of outside intervention if things went wrong. On October 27, Caesar made his final preparations. The poison materials were distributed to their intended targets, modified tools were positioned for quick access, and every participant understood their specific role and timing. Most importantly, the signal system was tested one final time to ensure that the coordinated action would begin simultaneously across all sections of the plantation. That night, as Caesar lay in his cabin listening to the sounds of the Georgia swamps, he understood that within 24 hours, either he and his collaborators would be dead, or the Matthews plantation would never be the same. There was no middle ground, no possibility of partial success or negotiated compromise. The morning of October 28 would begin the final day of the old order on the Matthews plantation. Saturday, October 28, 1834, began with the oppressive humidity that had characterized the entire harvest season. The enslaved workers of the Matthews plantation went through their morning routines showing no outward sign of the revolution that would unfold after sunset. 18 years of survival under brutal conditions had taught them to hide every thought and emotion behind masks of submission. The morning work proceeded with unusual efficiency, as if the knowledge of what was coming had given everyone renewed energy. Caesar moved between work gangs, ostensibly checking on tool maintenance and harvest progress, but actually conducting final confirmations that every aspect of the plan remained in place. Sarah began her part of the operation during the afternoon, when she made her rounds treating minor injuries and distributing medicines to workers who had been hurt during the week's brutal harvest push. Hidden among her legitimate medical supplies were the small containers of processed plant material that would begin the evening's work. At 4 p.m., Maria entered Overseer Bradley's quarters under the pretense of cleaning and restocking his liquor supply. Bradley was still in the fields supervising the afternoon cutting, giving her the opportunity to introduce Sarah's preparation into his bottle of whiskey. The material dissolved completely, leaving no trace of its presence. Over the next 2 hours, similar actions were taken in 11 other overseer quarters across the plantation. The women who carried out these poisonings moved with the calm efficiency of people who understood that hesitation or nervousness could result in immediate detection and execution. By 6 p.m., the first reports began filtering back through the enslaved community's communication network. Bradley was showing signs of illness, complaining of stomach pains and dizziness. 3 other overseers were exhibiting similar symptoms. The plan was working, but not universally. Some overseers had not yet consumed enough of the poisoned alcohol to be significantly affected. Caesar received these reports and understood that the direct action phase would need to account for the partial success of the poisoning. This meant that some confrontations would be more dangerous than originally planned, requiring greater speed and coordination to overcome overseers who remained at full strength. As evening approached, Caesar positioned himself near the sugar processing building that would serve as the command center for the coordinated action. The timing was critical. Too early, and some overseers might still be alert and capable of organizing resistance. Too late, and those affected by poison might recover enough to become dangerous again. At 9 p.m., Caesar lit the fires that sent smoke signals across the plantation, officially beginning what would become known as the Savannah Harvest Uprising. The response was immediate and demonstrated the remarkable planning that had gone into the operation. In the southern cane fields, Solomon led 15 men in a coordinated attack on 2 overseers who were making their evening patrol rounds. The overseers, expecting nothing more than routine compliance from people they had terrorized for years, were completely unprepared for organized resistance with modified agricultural tools. Near the main processing facility, a group led by Maria surrounded the quarters of 3 overseers who had been incapacitated by Sarah's preparations. These men were eliminated quickly and quietly, their weapons confiscated and distributed among the enslaved workers who would need them for the more difficult confrontations ahead. The most challenging target was Overseer James Patterson, a younger man who had consumed no alcohol that evening and who was known for his vigilance and quick reflexes. Patterson realized something was wrong when he heard unusual sounds from across the plantation and saw the smoke signals that he didn't understand but recognized as dangerous. Patterson's attempt to reach the main house and alert Samuel Matthews became a desperate race through the cane fields. He was armed with a pistol and rifle, but he was being pursued by men who knew every path and hiding place on the plantation and who were motivated by 18 years of accumulated rage. The confrontation took place in a clearing between the cane fields and the main house. Patterson managed to wound 2 of his pursuers before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain. His death marked the completion of the first phase of the uprising. All 20 overseers were dead, and their weapons had been distributed among the formerly enslaved population. But Caesar understood that eliminating the overseers was only the beginning. Samuel Matthews remained in the main house with several armed house servants, and the plantation's isolation would not protect them once neighboring operations discovered what had happened. By midnight, the Matthews plantation was under the complete control of its formerly enslaved population. But Caesar and his collaborators knew they had perhaps hours before massive retaliation would arrive from Savannah and surrounding plantations. The question facing them was not whether they could hold the plantation permanently. That was impossible, but whether they could use their temporary freedom to achieve something that would justify the enormous risks they had taken. Some wanted to burn everything and disappear into the swamps. Others argued for making a defensive stand that would inflict maximum casualties on any retaliation force. Caesar proposed a third option: use the time they had to get as many people as possible to safety while making the plantation unusable for future sugar production. The next few hours would determine whether the Savannah Harvest Uprising would be remembered as a successful act of resistance or simply another tragedy in the long history of American slavery. The first light of October 29th revealed the Matthews plantation transformed beyond recognition. 20 overseer bodies lay scattered across the grounds, silent testimony to the most coordinated act of resistance Georgia had ever witnessed. 180 formerly enslaved people now controlled 800 acres of prime agricultural land, along with weapons, horses, and supplies that could sustain them, if they could find a way to escape the inevitable retaliation. Caesar stood in the main yard as sunrise painted the Georgia sky blood red, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether their victory would be permanent or merely symbolic. Reports from the plantation's borders indicated that smoke signals were already being sent to neighboring operations, meaning that word of the uprising would reach Savannah within hours. The decision facing the community was stark: attempt to hold and defend the plantation, or use their temporary control to facilitate escape attempts into the surrounding swamplands. Caesar knew that defense was ultimately hopeless. They lacked the numbers and resources to withstand a sustained attack from organized militia forces. But escape presented its own challenges. The group included elderly people, families with young children, and individuals who lacked the specialized knowledge needed to survive in the dangerous wetlands surrounding the plantation. Any escape attempt would mean permanently separating families and abandoning those who could not make the dangerous journey. Sarah proposed a third option that drew on her knowledge of the local environment and plant life. Rather than simply fleeing or making a doomed defensive stand, they could make the plantation useless for future agricultural operations while creating maximum confusion about the fate of its former enslaved population. The plan was devastatingly simple: destroy the sugar processing equipment, contaminate the wells and water sources, and set fires that would make the property unusable for years while providing cover for escape attempts. Most importantly, they would leave behind evidence suggesting that the entire enslaved population had perished in the destruction, discouraging pursuit into the swamps. Implementation began immediately. Solomon and his assistants used their knowledge of the sugar processing machinery to disable critical components in ways that would require months and enormous expense to repair. The massive grinding wheels that crushed cane were damaged beyond quick fixing, and the boiling facilities that concentrated sugar were systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, Sarah worked with several women to contaminate water sources throughout the plantation. Using her knowledge of plant toxins, she introduced materials that would make the water unsafe for human consumption or agricultural use without obvious signs of tampering that might alert incoming authorities to intentional sabotage. This incredible story of strategic thinking and coordinated resistance shows why this channel exists. Please share this video with anyone who needs to understand this powerful chapter of American history. The most psychologically difficult task was preparing false evidence of mass casualties. Bodies of the overseers were arranged to suggest a chaotic massacre followed by fire, while clothing and personal items belonging to the enslaved population were scattered and burned to suggest that they had perished in the destruction. By 8 a.m., approximately 60 people had departed in small groups using different routes toward the coast. These groups included those with the best knowledge of swamp navigation and the physical capability to survive a dangerous journey to potential freedom in Spanish Florida or hidden communities on the Sea Islands. The remaining 120 people prepared for the final phase of the operation, creating a conflagration that would destroy the plantation's agricultural infrastructure while providing cover for their own disappearance into the wetlands. The fires would also serve as a signal visible for miles, ensuring that neighboring plantations would focus on the apparent destruction rather than organizing immediate pursuit. As morning progressed, smoke on the horizon indicated that help was already being organized in Savannah. The time for preparation was ending, and the time for final action was beginning. Caesar gathered the remaining population and explained the timing for the last phase of their operation. The fires would begin at noon, when the wind patterns would carry smoke in directions that would maximize confusion while minimizing danger to escape routes. Everyone would have specific assigned paths into the swamps, with meeting points established for those who successfully evaded initial pursuit efforts. At 11:30 a.m., Caesar made his final inspection of the plantation that had been their prison for so many years. The sugar processing facility was beyond repair, the water sources were contaminated, and the main house had been stripped of anything valuable that could be carried into the swamps. Most importantly, the community that had been held in bondage for generations had proven that they possessed the intelligence, coordination, and determination that their oppressors claimed they lacked. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they had demonstrated their own humanity in ways that could never be forgotten or denied. At exactly noon on October 29, 1834, fires began simultaneously in dozen locations across the Matthews plantation. Within minutes, the sugar processing facility was engulfed in flames that would burn for days, sending a column of black smoke into the sky that could be seen from Savannah 20 miles away. As the fires spread, the last 120 formerly enslaved people of the Matthews plantation disappeared into the Georgia swamps, following paths that their ancestors had used for generations to escape oppression and find freedom in places where their humanity could not be denied or destroyed. The column of smoke rising from the Matthews plantation reached Savannah by 1 p.m. on October 29, triggering the largest manhunt in Georgia history. Colonel James Habersham assembled 2 companies of state militia along with mounted volunteers from every plantation within 50 miles, creating a force of over 400 men dedicated to capturing the escaped enslaved population. When Habersham's force reached the smoldering ruins, they found systematic destruction that defied their expectations. The bodies of 20 overseers lay scattered across the grounds, but the coordinated demolition of sugar processing equipment suggested planning that challenged every assumption about enslaved capabilities. Most puzzling was evidence regarding the fate of the plantation's population. Burned clothing and scattered personal items suggested many had perished in the fires, but the absence of bodies raised questions about whether significant numbers had escaped into the surrounding wetlands. Colonel Habersham faced a critical decision. If substantial numbers had escaped into the swamps, pursuing them would require weeks of dangerous work in terrain that favored the fugitives. But failure to pursue would signal that successful escape was possible, potentially inspiring similar uprisings throughout the region. The manhunt began with tracking dogs from Charleston, but the animals proved useless in the swamp environment. Constant moisture eliminated scent trails, while complex geography made it impossible to determine fugitive movements from any given point. Caesar's group had chosen escape routes based on decades of accumulated knowledge about the coastal wetlands. They knew which paths remained passable, which islands provided secure camping, and which waterways could be crossed safely without boats. Most importantly, they understood that pursuit forces would be operating in unfamiliar terrain where every advantage lay with those being hunted. The wetlands contained natural hazards, quicksand, poisonous snakes, alligators, and toxic plants that could eliminate pursuers who lacked specialized knowledge. After 2 weeks of fruitless searching, with several men lost to the swamp's dangers, Colonel Habersham abandoned the official manhunt. Of the 120 people who entered the swamps on October 29th, approximately 80 successfully reached safe destinations. Caesar's group spent 6 weeks navigating coastal wetlands before reaching a hidden community on Sapelo Island, where they joined a settlement that had existed for decades. Sarah's medical knowledge made her invaluable to the island community. She spent her remaining years caring for people who had found freedom in one of the few places where their humanity was recognized and protected. The successful escape sent shockwaves throughout the slaveholding South. Insurance companies began excluding coverage for losses related to insurrection and escape, making plantation economics more precarious and forcing many owners to reconsider the profitability of their operations. The Matthews Plantation uprising reverberated far beyond the burned ruins of a single operation. Emergency legislative sessions addressed what political leaders recognized as a fundamental challenge to the entire slavery system. The coordination and effectiveness displayed by the escaped population contradicted every argument used to justify human bondage. New laws made any gathering of more than 2 enslaved people without white supervision punishable by death. Penalties for literacy were increased dramatically, while plantation owners were required to maintain detailed surveillance records. Most tellingly, property values for enslaved people dropped significantly as buyers became reluctant to invest in people capable of organized resistance. The uprising influenced the growing abolitionist movement. Detailed accounts carried north were published in abolitionist newspapers, providing evidence that enslaved people possessed intelligence and organizational capabilities that slavery's defenders claimed they lacked. Frederick Douglass argued that the Matthews resistance proved people were held in bondage not because of natural inferiority, but because they were systematically oppressed by a profitable system that denied their humanity while exploiting their labor. Thank you for staying with this powerful story of resistance and survival. Please share this video and subscribe to ensure that these essential chapters of American history are preserved and remembered. The personal stories of escapees became legendary within enslaved communities throughout the Southeast. Caesar's planning, Sarah's botanical knowledge, and Solomon's technical skills were remembered in songs and stories that preserved their legacy while teaching practical lessons about resistance and survival. Sarah lived until 1871, spending 37 years as a free woman on Sapelo Island, training younger women in botanical and medical knowledge. Caesar established a boat-building operation that helped over 200 freedom seekers reach safe destinations before his death in 1863. The plantation was never rebuilt. Samuel Matthews, financially ruined, sold the property to creditors who found it impossible to restore profitability. The land eventually became a wildlife preserve, with only scattered foundations marking where one of America's most significant acts of coordinated resistance had taken place. The Matthews Plantation Uprising represents one of the most significant examples of organized resistance in American history, demonstrating that systematically dehumanized people retained the capacity for complex planning, effective coordination, and ultimate sacrifice in service of human dignity. Their story survives in oral traditions throughout the Southeast, in documentary evidence that could not be suppressed, and in inspiration provided to generations who refused to accept that human beings could be treated as property. Caesar and his collaborators understood that some things are worth fighting for, and that people who assert their own humanity, even when that assertion seems hopeless, create legacies extending far beyond their own lives. Their courage echoes across centuries, reminding us that freedom is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right that must be claimed by those brave enough to demand it.